They say history is written by the victors. But what happens when the victors were the villains all along? Tonight's story begins in Spain, in a palace soaked in gold and secrets. It's October 14th, 1784. The Bourbon dynasty reigns, and a newborn's cry pierces the walls of the royal bedroom like a crack in marble. That baby is Ferdinand, Prince of Asturias. He will one day become King of Spain. But this isn't a story about a noble ruler. This is a story about obsession, betrayal, and the slow, surgical death of a kingdom. Born to King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, Ferdinand should have had it all: the power, the crown, the love of a nation. But even before he could walk, something was off. Behind the palace walls, something darker was taking root. That man? Manuel Godoy. Officially, he was the king's chief minister. Unofficially, people called him the queen's lover. Whether true or not, the rumors stuck. He was young, handsome, ruthless, and somehow, despite being born a commoner, he controlled the levers of the Spanish Empire. To Ferdinand, this man was everything he wasn't. Ferdinand wasn't charming. He wasn't strong. He wasn't even particularly smart. What he was paranoid. He believed correctly that his parents trusted Godoy more than their own son. At age 10, he was already learning how to plot in whispers. At an age when most kids are learning to ride horses, Ferdinand was learning how to form conspiracies. By 1800, Ferdinand was 16. Godoy was now Prince of the Peace, ruling Spain behind the throne. And Ferdinand? He began organizing secret meetings with military officers and nobles who hated Godoy. They called themselves Fernandinos. They weren't just gossiping. They were preparing for a coup against his own father. But Ferdinand made a mistake. In 1807, he reached out to Napoleon Bonaparte, hoping France would support his secret claim to the throne. Instead, Napoleon played him like a violin. That same year, under Godoy's orders, Spanish troops allowed French soldiers to march through Spain to invade Portugal. But Napoleon had no interest in Portugal. Once across the border, the French army turned and took control of Madrid. Charles IV was humiliated. Godoy fled, and in the chaos, Ferdinand made his move. In March 1808, his father abdicated. Ferdinand VII was crowned king, but it didn't last. Napoleon summoned Ferdinand to Bayonne, France, to confirm his kingship. Ferdinand, young, eager, insecure, went. He thought he was walking into a coronation. He walked into a cage. Inside, Napoleon cornered him. With subtle threats and sham diplomacy, he forced Ferdinand to abdicate. Then, he did the same to Charles IV. Spain was leaderless. And in the vacuum, Napoleon installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain. Ferdinand was now a prisoner in Château de Valençay in France. For 6 years, Ferdinand lived in luxury, but it was still a prison. He had books, gardens, even servants. But every time he looked outside, there were guards. While Spain was bleeding in rebellion, Ferdinand dined in exile and wrote letters. Letters filled with bitterness, with plans, with rage. But something else was happening in Spain. People were rising. Civilians, guerrillas, monarchists, they fought Joseph Bonaparte tooth and nail. And in 1813, after years of war, Napoleon lost. In the Treaty of Valençay, Napoleon released Ferdinand. Spain cheered. "Our rightful king is coming back," they cried. That they didn't know, their nightmare was just beginning. In the spring of 1814, Ferdinand VII returned to Spain as a hero. For 6 years, he'd been Napoleon's prisoner, trapped in a gilded cage in France while his country burned. And now, the people called him El Deseado, the Desired One. Their king, their savior, their last hope after years of chaos. But there was a problem. Ferdinand wasn't the man they thought he was. In fact, by the time he walked into Madrid wearing that velvet cloak and cold stare, Ferdinand had already decided that freedom in Spain was a mistake. When Ferdinand returned, the Spanish government wasn't empty. In his absence, reformers had written the Constitution of 1812, a liberal document that limited royal power, gave rights to citizens, and even created a parliamentary government. Think of it like Spain's version of the Bill of Rights. And Ferdinand? He swore to uphold it. Publicly. Privately? He despised it. Just 2 months after returning, Ferdinand abolished the Constitution, arrested its writers, and declared himself an absolute monarch. It was like Spain hit rewind. Back to feudalism. Back to fear. But Ferdinand's paranoia had only just begun. After reclaiming power, Ferdinand turned Spain into a palace of whispers. He didn't trust his ministers. He didn't trust the army. He didn't even trust his own advisors. Instead, he built a massive secret police network, tasked with rooting out anyone who questioned his rule. Writers, priests, soldiers, farmers. If you had a thought Ferdinand didn't like, you vanished. He restored the Inquisition, shut down newspapers, and outlawed political clubs. But that wasn't enough. He wanted loyalty not just in public, but in hearts. And when Spain's economy collapsed under his mismanagement, he found a new group to blame. Liberals. He called them traitors, foreign agents, enemies of God, and thousands were imprisoned, exiled, or executed without trial. Outside of Spain, European leaders were stunned. Even Napoleon, now exiled, reportedly joked that Ferdinand had become worse than him. Spain was broke. Its colonies in Latin America were revolting. And Ferdinand? He was too busy banning newspapers and arresting teachers. To the world, he looked like a puppet not to France this time, but to his own ego. But while Europe mocked him, a storm was building inside Spain. On January 1st, 1820, in a small town near Cadiz, a group of Spanish soldiers refused to march. Their commander, Colonel Rafael del Riego, stood on a crate and made a speech. He wasn't asking for riches. He wasn't asking for a republic. He was asking for one thing: bring back the Constitution of 1812. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Cities rose up, the army split, and by March, Ferdinand was surrounded. He surrendered, and with shaking hands, he reinstated the Constitution he had burned. But this wasn't redemption. This was survival. For 3 years, Spain was a constitutional monarchy again. Liberals ruled. Reforms passed. Hope flickered. Ferdinand waited. In April 1823, a massive French army, 100,000 strong, crossed into Spain. Their goal? Restore Ferdinand to absolute power. They were called the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, and they crushed the liberals within months. By October, Ferdinand was back on the throne, and this time, he was done pretending. He abolished the Constitution again, executed liberal leaders, and turned Spain into a prison of fear. Schools were purged, books burned, science labeled heresy. Even private letters were opened and censored. Ferdinand wasn't just a tyrant. He was a man obsessed with control. And by now, he had nothing else. By the late 1820s, Ferdinand was aging. He had no male heir, no legacy, no allies. His body was failing, but his paranoia wasn't. He married 4 times, desperate for a son. But only one child survived, a daughter, Isabella. In 1830, he passed the Pragmatic Sanction, allowing her to inherit the throne. And just like that, he rewrote centuries of Spanish law, angering his own brother, Don Carlos, who believed he should rule instead. That war, the Carlist Wars, would erupt after Ferdinand's death. But by the time he took his last breath in 1833, Spain was already cracked beyond repair. Ferdinand VII began as a prisoner king, trapped by Napoleon, crowned by chaos. But when he returned to power, he didn't free Spain. He chained it. And in doing so, he became the ultimate puppet prince, a man controlled not by foreign kings, but by his own fear, rage, and obsession. In 1820, Spain was on fire. Not from war, not yet, but from something more dangerous: hope. For a brief moment, Spaniards tasted what they hadn't known in generations: a government built on ideas, not bloodlines. A constitution, a voice. But behind the scenes, something else was brewing. Not just a king's revenge, but a full betrayal, not by one man, but by an entire system designed to crush freedom, profit off chaos, and sacrifice the very people it was supposed to protect. This is the story of the Spanish liberal dream and how it was stabbed in the back. Rafael del Riego was extranjero, thin, thoughtful, a former prisoner of war. But he had one thing most soldiers didn't: conviction. He believed Spain deserved better, that the Constitution of 1812 could save the nation. His revolt wasn't just military, it was moral. The revolution spread in weeks. Ferdinand VII, cornered and panicked, reinstated the Constitution. Spain became, for the first time in history, a modern constitutional monarchy. The liberals were in power, but they made one fatal mistake. They believed the king's promise. While liberal ministers passed reforms, Ferdinand waited, smiled, nodded, but behind closed doors he wrote letters to Austria, to Russia, to France, to the Holy Alliance. He begged Europe's monarchs, send troops, crush the liberals, restore my power. And in 1823, they answered. The 100,000 sons of St. Louis invaded. Ferdinand publicly pleaded ignorance. Privately, he prepared prison lists. The liberal government was caught off guard. They had believed in a king who didn't believe in them. With the French troops behind him, Ferdinand VII abolished the Constitution again. But this time, he didn't just undo laws. He targeted the people who wrote them. Rafael del Riego, hero of the 1820 uprising, was captured, tortured, and hanged in public. Universities were purged. Books were burned. The press was silenced. Even being in possession of liberal writings could mean prison or death. Ferdinand didn't just betray the Constitution. He betrayed a generation. The lucky ones ran. Intellectuals, poets, professors, whole families escaped to Britain, France, even Mexico. They called themselves the afrancesados, Spaniards influenced by Enlightenment ideals. To Ferdinand, they were traitors. Their homes were seized. Their names erased from public records. Some were hunted down across borders. Ferdinand wanted Spain to forget them, but their ideas? They didn't die so easily. Even under tyranny, Spain whispered. Secret societies formed like the Comuneros and the Carbonari, using Masonic codes and underground presses. Smuggled pamphlets spread in markets and churches. Songs disguised as folk tunes carried subversive messages. Ferdinand ruled, yes, but Spain was waiting. By the time Ferdinand died in 1833, the cost of his betrayal was staggering. The economy was wrecked. Spain's colonies in Latin America? Gone. 2 generations of thinkers and reformers, imprisoned or dead. But maybe the worst part? He set Spain on a path to civil war. His daughter Isabella would inherit a shattered throne. His brother Carlos would launch a bloody revolt. And liberal versus absolutist would define Spain for the next 80 years. All because one man, one king couldn't share power. History often remembers tyrants as monsters. But Ferdinand VII, he was worse. He was a man who smiled as he stabbed, who swore loyalty with one hand and signed death warrants with the other. The betrayal of Spain wasn't a coup. It wasn't a revolution. It was a promise broken. When a tyrant dies, you expect the horror to end. The people cheer. The chains fall. The future begins. But not in Spain. Because when Ferdinand VII died in 1833, the monster wasn't buried with him. His death unleashed something even worse: a civil war, a family feud, and a brutal fight over a single question: who gets the crown? And in the chaos that followed, the ghost of the tyrant returned. This is the story of how one king's cruelty didn't die with him, it multiplied. Ferdinand had a problem. He had no son, only a daughter, Isabella. Tradition said she couldn't rule, but Ferdinand wanted her to. He revoked the Salic law, a centuries-old rule that banned female succession. His brother, Don Carlos, wasn't happy. Carlos believed he was the rightful heir. Devout, conservative, popular among Spain's rural clergy and peasantry. When Ferdinand died, the crown passed to his 3-year-old daughter, and the nation split in two. It started like a family dispute. It ended like a bloodbath. Supporters of Isabella the Isabelinos were liberals, urban elites, and constitutional monarchists. Supporters of Carlos the Carlist were traditionalists, rural farmers, and ultra-conservative clergy. They fought not just for a crown, but for 2 different Spains. One wanted progress, the other wanted the past. Battles like Lucana, Ramales, and Morella left entire towns flattened. Children were orphaned, village rasé, and through it all, Ferdinand's ghost loomed. Even dead, Ferdinand VII was weaponized. Carlos called him the true king. They painted liberals as betrayers of his legacy. Liberals, ironically, used Ferdinand as a warning proof of what Spain should never become again. He had become a symbol of both loyalty and loathing. And in this twisted memory war, both sides committed horrors, executions without trial, civilian massacres, priests tortured for siding with the enemy. Ferdinand had ruled with repression. His death sparked 1,000 private tyrannies. Queen Isabella II ascended the throne at age 3, but she didn't rule. Her mother, Maria Cristina, served as regent. To survive, Maria Cristina allied with liberals, the very people her late husband had persecuted. It was political irony at its peak. But that alliance made enemies. The Carlists doubled down. Rebellion turned to holy war. Spain became a battlefield of ideology. Old versus new. Church versus state. Tradition versus reason. And caught in the middle, a child. After 7 years of brutal war, Spain was exhausted. In 1839, the Carlist General Morodo and liberal commander Espartero signed the Convention of Vergara. Thousands of Carlists surrendered in exchange for amnesty. But peace had a cost. The monarchy was weakened. The church was stripped of land and power. Radicalism festered underground. The war ended. But the wounds? They never healed. Ferdinand VII never lived to see what he'd done. But he fathered more than Isabella. He fathered division. Spain would suffer 2 more Carlist wars, coups, foreign invasions, and eventually a dictatorship under Franco. Every time Spain tried to move forward, it tripped over Ferdinand's shadow. Because Ferdinand didn't just return as a ghost. He returned as an idea that power must be absolute. That descent is treason. That kings rule by divine right, not by law. And until that idea was finally exorcised, Spain would never be free. Most tyrants end when the tomb closes. Ferdinand VII was different. His death began a new tyranny, not of a man, but of memory. His cruelty didn't just linger. It multiplied. The war for his throne, it tore a nation apart. Because sometimes the worst tyrants are the ones who never leave.